Who's winning the room? Who's winning the region? Yes, Joe Biden. Back home, he's got inflation and uphill battle to the midterms. But that's no bother for Indo-Pacific allies with the launch of a regional trade partnership this Monday. Plans for a partnership to stare down maritime threats. And Tuesday's Tokyo summit of the Quad, which despite its denials looks more and more like the Far East's answer to NATO. Alongside the US, Japanese and Indian leaders will ask about the Quad's new guy, Australia's freshly elected Prime Minister, and whether the language will be as blunt as with his predecessor. We'll also gauge reaction out of Beijing, Xi Jinping's government, which has to contend with scrutiny on several fronts, with the UN human rights chief visiting Xinjiang province, and business leaders anxious over a zero-COVID policy that's disrupting global supply chains to the point some are even contemplating pulling out. In the long run, will it all matter? Does China need to soften its image? Or will Beijing simply double down? Today in the France 24 debate, we're wondering, is this anti-China alliance turning into an Indo-Pacific NATO? Joining us, Jean-François Di Meglio, president of the Asia Center think tank. Welcome back to the show. With us as well, China business consultant Jean-Paul Chang. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
And David Camero, adjunct professor at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. How are things?
Pleasure to be back.
And we welcome by telephone French Senator Hélène Conway-Mouret, who sits on the Senate's Foreign Affairs Commission as its secretary. Thank you for being with us.
Well, good evening.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. After South Korea, Japan, Joe Biden's first full day, concluding with a dinner at an upscale restaurant with Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and his wife. This after offering up plenty of food for thought during their joint press conference. Yes, Joe Biden calling out China over Taiwan.
They're his strongest remarks on the issue to date. On Monday, President Biden warned that the US would use force to defend Taiwan militarily in case of aggression from Beijing, saying that China is flirting with danger.
We stand firmly with Japan and with other nations not to let that happen. And my expectation is it will not happen.
Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
You are.
That's a commitment we made.
The remarks came on his first Asia tour as US president, where he drew parallels between Taiwan and Kyiv. Words that didn't go down well in Beijing, who consider the small island state one of its breakaway provinces. And President Xi Jinping has made his objectives of reunification with the mainland known.
No one should underestimate the firm resolve, staunch will and strong ability of the Chinese people in defending national sovereignty and territorial integrity. China will take resolute action to safeguard our sovereign and security interests. Our words will be our actions.
Taiwan has long anticipated an invasion by Chinese forces, even conducting large-scale military exercises in preparation in the summer of 2020. And in recent months, fears have heightened after a record number of Chinese aircraft entered Taiwanese airspace. Located only 180 kilometers from the Chinese coast, the democratic island of Taiwan is concerned of suffering the same fate as Ukraine. China has previously threatened to use military force should Taiwan formally proclaim its independence.
Now, Jean-François Di Meglio, it's one thing to say that you'll assist Taiwan militarily. It's another to say that you'll intervene alongside Taiwan.
That's right. Well, very interesting Biden's sentence, because in the first place, he says, we stand with Japan. So as if Japan was basically showing the way to the US, which is quite paradoxical. But that can be explained because the US position about Taiwan is, on the one hand, the Taiwan Relations Act, which means that indeed, as you rightly said, US would assist, but not necessarily intervene. And on the other hand, this key word is so far strategic ambiguity. And what Biden does today is getting out of strategic ambiguity.
Is that a blunder?
Well, my interpretation is that it's not designated as speaking to the Taiwan public. It's designated to speaking to the US voters, because you have the midterm elections, as it was mentioned. And if you want to grab some votes which might go to the Republican side, then you have to say something like this. In Taiwan, I'm not sure that my friends in Taiwan take it for granted what Biden says. Of course, there is a sigh of relief because they were longing for this type of sentence. Yet, how long can you trust this type of sentence? I don't know. And you better prepare within Taiwan and be sure that you can also defend yourself at least for 1 week.
Is this all just a bit of political theater? Is that how it will be read in Taipei and Beijing?
It's not only a theater, I believe, because Jean-François said something very important. The strategic ambiguity shown by the United States government so far was something acceptable for Beijing. So each time you are breaking with this rule of ambiguity, the Chinese side, the Beijing side, is forced to react very strongly. That's what they did. They say we said already, we promised to defend our core interests, etc., and we keep our promises. So it's a very strong answer. That means that you want to play with us on this field of the risk of war. Okay, let's go. So the language could have unexpected effects in long term. So it's very important to keep on both sides the strategic ambiguity to avoid this kind of uncontrollable prolongation.
That's exactly, Hayden Conway, the criticism that was leveled against Joe Biden when he was in Poland, saying he was giving away too much with his harsh rhetoric against Russia. Do you agree with Jean-Paul Chang?
Yes, but at the same time, what I read in the Americans' position today is a direct follow-up on what has happened with Russia, where the American people that I've speaking to for the past week tell me that maybe if we had stronger, sorry, I can hear that it's terrible. So
you're hearing an echo in on the connection. Maybe what we'll do is we'll call you. We'll call you back, and sorry about that. We'll call you back, and that way we'll be able to hear it better. Your thoughts, very briefly, on this, David Cameron.
Well, Xi Jinping, in a sense, is his own worst enemy. He's replying to increasing nationalism within China itself, especially for the younger generation. Communism is no longer a motivating trope for the people of China. So what's left? Patriotism is the last refuge of scoundrels. And so Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, now in the South Pacific, is in fact feeding, is a vicious circle now of then...
So what you're saying is that the remarks by Joe Biden are a response to the fact that you've had increasing number of flyovers of...
Yeah, in part, there's been provocations and then there's counter-provocations. So in a sense... This, Biden is doing Xi Jinping a service by making these sorts of comments, which seems to demonstrate to Chinese public opinion, that the Americans can't be trusted and that they are our enemy.
All right, and just as with NATO, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has sort of steeled the resolve of member states. What we're seeing is the Quad now seems to be getting a second win these days. Case in point, no sooner had Australia's new centre-left prime minister been sworn in that Anthony Albanese was getting on a plane to Tokyo alongside his new foreign minister, Penny Wong, of Chinese heritage, but also resolute on the one issue where Albanese defeated his predecessor, Scott Morrison.
So the meetings that we will have are going to be very important in a good way to send a message to the world that there's a new government in Australia, and it's a government that represents a change in terms of the way that we deal with the world on issues like climate change.
All right, that was not the clip we wanted to play, because what he said in his other clip was that on this issue, on China, it was definitely going to be continuity.
There is going to be continuity, perhaps a little bit less anti-Chinese rhetoric than that of Scott Morrison. The Labour Party, the question of how one deals with China traverses the political divide within Australia. So, for example, you had recently Kevin Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister, a Chinese speaker and probably the greatest expert on China, publishing a book called The Avoidable War, basically arguing that there are two great powers in the Asia-Pacific, the US and China, and that Australia needs to do what countries in Southeast Asia do, which is to kind of hedge and try and find a balance between the two. So, yes, at the same time, there's the alliance with the United States, which has been reaffirmed by the Labour Party, who didn't want to open that up as an issue during the election campaign. But at the same time, there will be a sort of a more nuanced approach, I think, in terms of the rhetoric used in relation to China. But once again, the Chinese have done themselves their own disservice by what they've done in the Solomon Islands and now in Kiribati.
We'll talk about Kiribati in a moment, but let me just ask Jean-François Di Mengio, because we saw, just to remind our viewers, we saw a trade war between China and Australia the last couple of years.
Absolutely. We saw a trade war, and just to pick up on what David was just saying, I think nuance is going both ways, because yes, indeed, we might have a more nuanced position vis-à-vis China, but if you look at Kevin Rudd's position over years, Kevin Rudd used to be, I would say, pro-China before, but
panda lover.
Exactly. But now he turned to a more nuanced position, and when he has something to say against China, he does say it, even though he's the CEO of the Asia Society and is very much involved in the region, and he speaks out much more now. So the nuance is going both ways, I think, in Australia. So that probably balances out what might happen in the future.
All right, coincidence of the calendar. Albanese elected Saturday, the day that France's new foreign minister took the reins in a cabinet reshuffle from Jean-Yves Le Drian. Watch the reaction of the incoming Catherine Colonna when she stands next to Le Drian as he bids good riddance to Australia's Scott Morrison in last year's scuttling of a French submarine sale contract.
I cannot help but say that the defeat of Prime Minister Morrison suits me very well. Because the actions taken against France, at the time they were committed, were brutal and cynical. And I even find it tempting to say a form of notorious incompetence.
Hélène Conway-Mouret, what was your reaction when you heard Jean-Yves Le Drian?
Well, my reaction is that Jean-Yves Le Drian was very angry at the time of what happened, and I think his anger hasn't diminished. But as I had said before, and I reacted to his first words, was that it's not really what one expects of a foreign minister. So I think, what happened was not very nice, and I think everybody agreed, and there was a discussion between President Biden and President Macron about it, and I think it's all behind us. So I think it's a shame somehow that Jean-Yves Le Drian, whom I like very much on a personal basis, and I think was an excellent minister overall, was a bit out of place for me.
Senator, we've been speaking about how there are two main powers in the Pacific, the U.S. and China. Of course, France is the other big military presence in the Pacific. The scuttling of that submarine contract, does it send a message for years and decades to come?
No, I think it's all behind us now. I think we all have interests. I mean, as you rightly reminded us, we have interest there because of territories, and we do protect the maritime areas that we have against illegal fishing and the destruction of natural resources, and also fight trafficking. And I think our presence is very well appreciated by our partners and allies. And what we see in the Indo-Pacific is a bit what we have in Europe. That is that we have a very big continental country that presents somehow a threat. Earlier on, I couldn't say what I wanted to say because it was a terrible echo and I could hear myself repeating myself 2 or 3 times after each word. But what I wanted to say is that President Biden, in his, the words that he has chosen this time, is trying to do what we all failed to do, that is to deter President Putin from invading Ukraine. And I think the threat to Taiwan is real, simply because as President Putin believes that Crimea and the Donbass belong to Russia, China thinks that Taiwan is part of, the big country, which China is. So, of course, the Taiwanese are not of that opinion. And so what we have now happening in Europe could happen in the Indo-Pacific. Now, whether the same words should be used, I'm not sure that President Xi Jinping and President Putin are the same. So one needs to be careful. But at the same time, I think the United States are opting for a deterrent position to kind of say that there is a coalition there, and if China moved towards invading Taiwan, there will be reprisals and going beyond just sanctions that we're applying to Russia at the moment.
And Conway Mouret, many thanks. I know you have to leave us early, but I want to thank you so much for joining us here.
Sorry about this.
In the France 24 debate. Thank you very much. Let me turn to you, Jean-Paul Chang. Are there lessons to be learned from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or are we completely mixing apples and oranges here?
No, for the lesson for the Chinese government is the possibility of a kind of a united West against any further action by Beijing toward Taiwan. That's they understand quite well that Americans are using the new unity of the Western countries, the mobilization around Ukraine, to draw all this solidarity toward the Indo-Pacific area and to try to use the same kind of excitement, united excitement against China. And also they are observing the extent of the sanctions, because they got this message that if you do something in the Taiwan Strait, we are going to sanction you, and in the much larger
So
scale.
Is that deterrence working?
I don't think so, because basically they don't have the plan to invade Taiwan right now. They are also playing the deterrent game. That means they are organizing the drills, the increasing the presence of their planes, ships, warships, etc., depending on the American verbal involvement in this Taiwan issue. But I don't think they're really right now to abandon the peaceful environment that they're benefiting right now in this region. So that's why they're protesting all the time against the people mixing the problems, saying you see Taiwan, the same problems, and Ukraine. And they start always the reaction by it's completely different. One is our internal domestic problem, the other one is an international issue. That's so they're trying everything to let people mix the both problems.
And as you say, it is nonetheless uniting the West. At Tuesday's summit, the Quad, those 4 nations to unveil a Pacific partnership with countries that include the likes of France and New Zealand. This with an eye to halting illegal fishing in territorial waters where Chinese trawlers are accused of turning off their transponders. to cast their nets. More broadly, there are shifting security alliances. David Cameron was referring to a moment ago, the Financial Times last week reporting that Beijing is negotiating a deal with the Kiribati Islands. You can see on this map here that the Kiribati Islands, they're tiny, but they span a huge expanse in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, right on the equator, and they're halfway between Australia and Hawaii. David, this is real?
Well, the question is the question of fishing, because that impacts on the lives of the people there. And this is always a problem, also with the Philippines, of the Chinese, in terms of they offer, on the one hand, sort of aid and development or certain kind of security. But on the other hand, they allow their fishing vessels and their armed militia, their fishing marine militia, to destroy the livelihood of local people in countries in which the Chinese are not necessarily accepted as being friendly neighbours. So there are all of these areas.
Is that any different from what the Japanese and the South Koreans do in West Africa when they trawl the ocean floor for all the fish?
No, it's not, but it's being covered in a sense by this sort of rhetoric about China being a good neighbour in providing these other common benefits to the countries, or at least to the regimes of those countries.
It's about fishing, Jean-François Di Meglio?
Well, for Japan, it's definitely about fishing. For China, it is about fishing because China has a huge issue of food security. China is the biggest nation in terms of fishing abroad. They need to cast their nets everywhere just to feed their population. But it's not only about fishing, obviously. When you see the geopolitical interest of China, it has nothing to do with the geopolitical interest from Japan. So obviously, it's part of a general expansion plan. Remember what happened with the Solomon Islands when the US delegation was about to land in Solomon Islands, and Solomon Islands struck a deal with China. That was one element more in the Indo-Pacific strategy by China. So there is obviously a strategy in South Pacific, and that, of course, has to talk to French leaders directly, because this is where our interests are.
Yeah, because it's next to French Polynesia. It's not far from New Caledonia either.
Right.
Jean-Paul Chang.
I believe the China threat for European countries is still very far. I mean, it's very abstract, very abstract.
What's at stake in the Pacific?
There's no threat from China from my point of view. I mean, so far, I don't see any threat against the Nouvelle-Calédonie or the French position in the Pacific. And it's not, even between Australia and China, you cannot see very precise point of, except the influence, the political influence. You'll be mentioning the Solomon Islands security agreement with Beijing. But otherwise, I don't see concrete antagonism, interest antagonist.
The agreement in the Solomon Islands with China is essentially about protecting Chinese citizens or people of Chinese origin within the Solomon Islands. And I think one of the worrying things about Chinese rhetoric today is to go back before the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence in the 1950s and to somehow see that the Chinese diaspora is still, or being portrayed as still having a loyalty towards China. And that's a very dangerous game to play, even in countries like Australia, where there is a significant Chinese diaspora. And to call into question, in a sense, their loyalty, also in other parts of the Asia-Pacific, is not doing those people a great service.
Yeah, I agree very much with what David says, because when we look at things, we just like your question was showing, we always think about gaining territory, but in the way I look at Chinese approach to it, I very often refer to the difference between a country and a culture. And when you see China, you see Zhongguo. the country which is called China. So in terms of country, of course, China will not expand its territory. However, when you speak about Zhonghua, which is the Chinese culture, you speak directly to people. And when you speak directly to people, this is what you call influence. And once you start with influence, you don't know where it will start and where it will stop.
And right now, is that influence waning or waxing in the Pacific?
Well, it's very difficult to tell because China is in a very difficult position currently. If I may say, I mean, the flip side of the coin is that we pay a lot of attention to those events, including the flights over Taiwan. But I think, even though those concerns are very strong in Chinese leaders' mind, the strongest concerns currently is economic stability in China and cohesion of the population. So yes, we have to pay attention to that, but we also have to understand that currently the concern in 2022 will be more on domestic issues than international issues,
And of course,
except if things turn very bad domestically.
In a nutshell, Chinese hard power exercise weakens its soft power influence, and so decades of efforts of Chinese soft power. Prior to having now the military ability to be able to assert itself in the way it's now doing, seems to, in my point of view, seems to have been wasted through these kind of more aggressive actions, which undermines China's cultural and economic influence, which is welcomed.
But those domestic issues have become international issues. I'll give one example. We have the UN's human rights chief, former Chilean President Michelle Bachelet, currently in China, traveling to Xinjiang province. Conditions of access kept secret amid outcry over the mass internment of Uyghur Muslims there.
High Commissioner Bachelet's visit to China will take a closed-loop approach. The two sides agreed not to arrange journalists following the visit.
No journalists who will be taking part. Xinjiang, it's an issue because the Muslim minority there is being persecuted, and it's also a cotton-growing region. Probably a lot of the T-shirts we wear have a bit of Xinjiang in them.
Not so much. Not so many. I mean, the Xinjiang produced cotton is mainly used in China and sold in Chinese market right now because of the.
But to David's point about hard power and soft power,
I believe that the Chinese trust more in hard power than in the soft power. They understand quite well what is soft power. They actually integrated completely all the lessons the Western country taught China in the past past years, 20, 30 years. They learn everything from outside: market economy, modernization, digital economy, etc., etc. They understand everything. They probably learn a lot about our political system. They know better our political system than we know about their political system even. So the soft power, they welcome that. But they know that they're not strong enough to have influence through the soft power. You want a proof? It's the image of China right now. The unanimity in the Western media about China as the evil country, the totalitarian, etc. The unanimous point of view about Xinjiang in the Western world, etc. So all this proves that actually the Chinese soft power is not really efficient. So they trust more in the hard power. That means the modernization of their army, reinforcement of their governance through all these social monitoring systems, the party organizations, efficiency. That's the hard power. I mean, they trust them more in hard power.
If you look at my students, what interests them in Asian culture is K-pop and Japanese mangas. Canto pop doesn't have any sort of resonance either in Southeast Asia, nor in Asia, nor certainly in Europe.
I fully agree with you. Chinese leaders understand strength and they like to be stronger. That's definitely right. However, in the Chinese speech, what you can hear more and more is that if you count the votes at UN, of course, on Ukraine, you had less votes going the way Russia wanted, but the votes in favor of what Russia wanted, or not against Russia, meaning the abstentions or the votes pro-Russia, represented more human beings than the other ones. And that's also an element in Chinese speech more and more, that we represent more than half of the planet. So yes, hard power is more important, but you also have this speech about what is it about democracy? Democracy is the number of votes you get. But if you count the human beings behind the votes at UN, if you apply the rules of democracy, we might win. So this is also coming slowly, but it comes. So it's part of soft power in a way.
And this visit by the UN human rights chief to China?
What can we hope about this? Come on. We have to support it, sure, but frankly speaking.
I believe that it's in the interest of the Chinese government that this trip is being made. They try to get out from this Xinjiang narrative.
It's not a narrative. I mean, it's fact. We have images of the internment camps.
Not in their analysis, because they decide that what they did in Xinjiang is against the terrorism, against the separatism, and it's a normal measure.
They're the way of thinking.
That's the way. So, and by the way, now you have much more accusation of a genocide by everybody. You know, the Ukrainian against the Russia against the genocide in the east, Ukraine, and the Chinese maybe believe that it's time to get out from this genocide accusation, etc. So maybe they hope that Madame Bachelet will moderate a little bit the vision of all this.
David Cameron?
I think, yes, I mean, it's a kind of symbolic visit, but they've learnt, the visit, for example, over COVID of the WHO delegation, who were allowed to meet some journalists, they've learned that lesson to have absolutely no journalists. So, they were simply, okay, we've had the visit, let's turn the page.
Right, and this time no journalists. Jean-François Di Meglio talking earlier about those domestic concerns right now. And just to show you, on Tuesday, when Joe Biden will be sitting alongside those other leaders, it's the fourth foreign tour since he took office. He's visited 10 different nations. The last time Xi Jinping went abroad dates back more than 2 years. It was January of 2020. And despite hosting the Olympics, China, for all intents and purposes, remains closed. Its zero-COVID strategy, putting the screws on cities like economic hub Shanghai, where authorities on Sunday reopened 4 of 20 subway lines, but only on a reduced schedule. More broadly, investors are retreating from Chinese stocks. The volume of trading never recovering from the pandemic. This while Wall Street returns to its frenzy of, this is volume, by the way. This isn't the way the market is going. That's a different graph. But nonetheless, do you get a sense, speaking to, and you're a former banker, speaking to people who you know from the business community, are they trying to get out of China and not go back, or are they just hedging their bets right now, waiting?
You have to hedge, because look, if you're a company which has invested a lot in China, well, of course you don't want to lose your assets and withdraw too quickly, whatever happens. So you have to hedge your bets. Conversely, you cannot be totally blind to the fact that China turns more and more selective about which sectors are most welcome. Remember, 18 months ago, we were just about to sign a cross-agreement on investment with China, and this failed. But this was supposed to open up everything. Was it a real sincere move by China or not? But we are far away from this situation now, and the Western companies have to take this into account. Some of them are welcome because they really bring value to China, and some of them are not welcome because China is slowing down and there is competition between the market, the market size of Western companies. And
so right now we're
my theory is that actually China wanted the EU-China investment agreement to fail, and they were happy that it was rejected by the European Parliament. Perhaps I'm a bit paranoid.
Yes.
Why is that?
Because actually the Chinese gave more than the Europeans did in that agreement. So the Chinese had to make more concessions than the Europeans did. So in terms of an economy which is now becoming more introverted, and remember that at the same time we've had the Trump trade wars, we've had COVID, which have already led to offshoring from China, for example, to Vietnam. Vietnam has been the great beneficiary of this sort of Sino-American COVID supply chain, Taiwan to some extent as well, situation.
David, yes, on paper, they were giving away more than the Europeans were giving away. Remember, in China, it's all about implementation. You can sign everything. Then when you come to implementation, there sometimes is a gap between what you sign and implementation. So there's no harm in signing. I don't think, frankly speaking, they wanted the thing to fail. I think it was really a backlash.
A backlash. Now you have a situation. And by the way, let me ask you, Jean-Paul Cheng, because we had at the beginning of COVID, the French finance minister saying, this is a great wake-up call to all of us. We have to shorten our supply chains. Too many key industries. We're dependent on goods, like pharmaceuticals and everything to do with computers that we have to go get them at the other side of the world, in particular in China. Those statements at the beginning of COVID, are they following through on those here in the West? Are those supply chains going to short?
It's not so obvious. Right now, you have a new COVID situation in China, and the logistics in some area of China are completely paralyzed, and that put the emphasis again on the supply chains problem. But in terms of investment, you cannot replace the Chinese ecosystem of all these subcontractor, all this service around the production overnight. You cannot do that, and because it's not just a single item investment. You have to invest in a lot of factors. So far, I don't think so. And in terms of dependence of China, from a French point of view, we are more dependent for our automotive industry on the north part of Italy than China. Unlike Germany, they have a huge automotive market in China, and they have a lot of subcontractor in China, everywhere in China, northeast, Shanghai, etc. So it's very different. It's a deeper dependence.
So that interdependence is not going to stop, you're saying?
I don't think it's very difficult. If you know the reality of the economic life, you will understand.
Well, how long will zero COVID continue? Because right now Shanghai remains very restrained. Beijing, they're ordering people to work from home.
Hopefully, I believe it will be short term. I mean, even the stock market in Shanghai is giving some sign of optimism, and the market is consolidating, and the volume is increasing again. So I believe that the completely clean case in the Shanghai district, I'm taking news from my friend every day, and the situation is improving, and we are coming to the stage that they are going to reopen everything very soon.
I think what we'll see is kind of a very selective deglobalization in perhaps in areas like battery production. We've seen projects in Europe on that area, projects now in Australia, to be less dependent on China for certain sort of key kind of components, but not a total de-globalization, if I can put it in those terms.
Yeah, it's doable for neighbors of China. For example, Korean companies have repatriated a lot of what they used to subcontract to China because they are very close, So the circuits were short. For Western countries, indeed, it will take some time, and it has to be done in a very smart way, pondering the pros and cons. So it's quite difficult. But just to be back to what Jean-Paul was saying, I'm not that sure that the zero COVID is nearing its end, because the issue is the vaccine. I think the end will be if China accepts to buy foreign vaccines, because the Chinese leaders know that their vaccine is not adapted to the situation. And there are not enough people vaccinated in China, and that's a concern for Chinese leaders.
And that has an impact globally. For example, there was an opinion poll in the Philippines. 95% of the population wanted to have Pfizer or the American vaccines. That those who were willing to take the Chinese vaccines was 2 or 3%. So there's also, the COVID saga is having also an implication, has implications for China's soft power and influence.
I want to discuss about the relative efficiency of the vaccine. But in terms of vaccination, if you take the world vaccine, the tracker in New York Times or in Financial Times, you can check that China has a very high percentage of vaccinated people. But it's true that there's a specific case for elder people, because they're being putting the focus for the working people, active population. So in the cities like Shanghai, my childhood friend who are now 70s above, half of them didn't get the vaccine. If you ask them why, they say, we've been spending 2 happy years after Wuhan. There was no COVID in China. So why to get a vaccine? No? And they are trapped, now, so because they are more exposed even to the Omicron stuff. So, but it's a remaining problem. But the rest of the population is quite well vaccinated, and decrease the seriousness of the Omicron impact.
Will China be more isolated when this Quad summit is concluded in Tokyo, Jean-François Di Meglio?
Well, it's also a matter of what Chinese leaders want and what price they are ready to pay for isolation. China has always gone through cycles, opening up and closing down. China has been closed down for quite a while. We may hope that a glimmer of hope and glimmer of light will come up to the Chinese leaders' mind and say the cycle of closing down is nearing its end. Maybe after the 20th Congress, we change our minds.
And do remember that with one of the members of the Quad, India, China has, real territorial disputes. I mean, even last year, I think there were fights on the border. So they're real territorial disputes. This is not abstract, as in the case in the South China Sea. This is real.
Yeah, but you have to notice also the divergence between India and the United States about the sanction against Russia.
Sure.
So that means the convergence of the Quad is not something completely easy, And you have the new change of leaders in Australia who can show more balanced position between the...
And the other issue with the Quad is over the question of values. With an ethno-nationalist government in India, questions of promoting democracy and human rights for the Quad are not on the table. I mean, it's all about, cooperation in strategic areas. But not about the promotion of democracy and human rights.
Even though it's kind of the subtext, it's what's implied. But as you say, ignoring the issues that India has.
It's a subtext, but it's based on this hubris that India is the world's largest democracy. India is declining into more and more forms of ethno-nationalist authoritarianism.
Yeah, and Korea is a real democracy, and Korea is just on the margins of Quad. I think a real sign of how strong this Quad and how meaningful this alliance is would be to include countries like Korea.
And would Japan agree to having South Korea?
Well, I think it's a real topic, and you hear very little.
There's a hypothesis of a Quad plus, with countries like Korea, Vietnam, and New Zealand as members. Sort of the B team, so to speak, a Quad B team, second division.
The Quad second division. Football season's over, but David Cameron misses it already. I want to thank you so much. I want to thank as well Jean-François Di Meglio, Jean-Paul Chang. I want to thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.